Hi, everybody, and welcome to our latest Google Hangout. This episode of How to Succeed in Architecture is all about resilient architecture. We invited Brad Lebin, Ibbi Almufti, and Matthew Peak here with us to talk about this topic. Okay, as always, this series of Hangouts is brought to you by Noveg, the leading online software store for design professionals, from architects to engineers, from filmmakers to graphic designers. We go to great lengths to find all the software you need so you can focus on your projects. All right, Ibbi, let's start with you. Will you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. My name is Ibbi Almufti. I'm in the Advanced Technology and Research Group at Arup in San Francisco. Arup is an international engineering, design, and consulting firm with around 12,000 designers around the world in around 70 different countries. We are proud to have recently won the Engineering News Record's Best Design Firm in California this past year. And some of our projects include the Sydney Opera House, the Gherkin in London, the CCTV building and Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing, and most recently the Las Vegas Wheel in Las Vegas, Nevada. My background really is in structural and earthquake engineering. I studied at UCLA and then UC Berkeley, where I got my master's. I've been working at Arup for about 8 years, and my focus has been primarily on performance-based design of buildings under extreme hazards like earthquakes, wind, and fire, and more recently been developing a resilience-based design framework called the REDi Rating System, which I'm sure we'll be talking about a little bit later.
Great, thank you so much, Ibbi, for joining us. And Matthew, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name is Matthew Peak. I'm principal of Peak Ancona Architecture. I'm also professor of architectural design, urban design, and building technology. I studied at Columbia, Yale, Berkeley, and finished up with a Fulbright at the University of Venice, where I became interested in flood-proofing and urbanism. I then lived in Italy for several years, collaborated with world-renowned architects and engineers, Renzo Piano's engineers, worked on a flood-proof building in Venice. Currently, my architecture firm, Peak Ancona, does residential, commercial, lead design. Our flood-proof house at Stinson Beach won an AIA California Design Award and was also selected by Architecture Vive in France as one of the most beautiful houses in America.
Awesome. Okay, and we also have an interview with actually Matt on our blog, so check it out. Okay, so Brad, tell us a little bit about your experience and what you do.
I'm an architectural designer with David Baker Architects, a firm here in San Francisco that's focused primarily on multifamily housing and typically in the urban context. We're known for our sustainable design. We're known for doing community-oriented work, for the integration of landscape, in collaboration with landscape architects. And we recently did a project as part of the AISF's Architecture in the City Festival called Local Cash, which was a pro bono project where we looked at strategies for incorporating resiliency into the existing urban fabric of San Francisco. So to kind of improve social resiliency in neighborhoods, and so I'll be talking a little bit about that today as well.
Great. Okay, so welcome all of you, and welcome everybody who's watching this. So let me start with my questions, and remember to send your questions on our Google page event. Okay, my colleague is reading all of them, and she will send me any question that you submit so we can ask live our panelists. Okay, here's my first question for the three of you. So is resilience the new sustainability? Who wants to take this first? Don't make me volunteer you.
You should take it.
You got me? Okay, I can take it. I'm only an engineer, so sustainability is not necessarily my primary focus, but it's always a part of what we do as engineers. I would say yes, resilience is the new buzzword, especially as it relates to climate change resilience. So in that sense, yes. But I would say that to be sustainable, by definition, really means that you have to be resilient as well. And so, for example, I would say building a LEED Platinum building or a Living Building Challenge building and putting it in the middle of San Francisco, for example, and not considering the performance or the beyond code performance of the building in earthquakes is not sustainable, really. In fact, I think resilience really should be a prerequisite of the higher, I guess I would say the higher sustainability ratings, let's say the LEED rating system. So to get a platinum, you really have to design the building to be, I would say, functional after an earthquake. And this is an example. I'm using earthquakes. I would, I would say the same thing for other natural hazards like flooding and so forth. So if you haven't designed for the possibility of, let's say, an earthquake that could cause significant damage to a building over its lifetime, then you really haven't considered the life cycle impacts of disaster. So imagine your building gets damaged, all of those components that you've designed to be, the most sustainable components, those might have to go into a landfill. So that's not very sustainable. So I think there's lots of synergies between resilience and sustainability, but I would say resilience almost falls under sustainability. You have to do it.
Okay, Brad, what is your take on this?
Yeah, I sort of agree with you that resilience is in many ways kind of an extension of sustainability. I sort of think of sustainability having to do with growing out of a recognition that humans are having an impact on our ecosystems and on at kind of a global scale. And I think sustainability is really about kind of doing less harm with buildings and a recognition that in fact, buildings can have a negative impact on the environment. I think resiliency differs a little bit in that it's a recognition, I think, from events like Hurricane Sandy and Katrina that not only are we changing the environment, but it's starting to have direct negative impacts on cities and communities, and so there's a kind of uncertainty and a greater feeling of immediacy that we actually need to do proactive things in our buildings that are going to allow them to respond and stay sort of online after events that we're not even sure necessarily what they're going to be. So I think resiliency is kind of an extension of sustainability. I also think that it's a little bit different from sustainability in the sense that I think sustainability is something that is really important and it has benefits for everyone, and the more buildings that are sustainable, the better. But I think that resiliency is something that, because anyone can be affected by a hurricane, it's something that, in a way, everyone sort of deserves to be in a resilient city and a resilient community. So there's almost like a social equality component of resiliency that I think is a little bit different than sustainability, where it's sort of like the more the better, but with sustainability, but with resiliency, it's almost like everyone really needs to have access to it. So there's almost a sense of immediacy.
Keep that in mind, because I want to get back to that point, actually, which I think is very interesting. Matt, I see you're hiding there behind an awesome map. So
I'm hiding behind my images. Yeah.
Okay, behind your images. So what's your take on this?
So my take is related to some of the images I want to show you. So this is actually a map from Native Americans showing what they believe America will look like 50 to 100 years from now. I hope this is not the case, but you can see why resiliency should be a buzzword. I agree, it's part of sustainability. I also hope that it doesn't become the new thing that becomes compromised, essentially, because I think several years ago our government made the initiative to set a goal, which we're actually not meeting, to stop the melting of the ice caps. So this is actually a pretty accurate map of what happens if all the ice caps melt. The Central Valley is flooded. I'll give you a zoom. Our levees break. There's no more agriculture in California. We've seen some of these images already with Sandy. There's erosion along the Florida coast. Virginia, Norfolk, ironically, is an area which at high tide, they can't even access some of their religious facilities. Even the Great Lakes are facing erosion and the potential rising sea levels. So I have my own ideas about how to be resilient. Our flood-proof house was one I mean, it's a serious project. It's actually built, but it's also a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's saying, you know, here's your house 50 years from now if we don't do something. And so, you know, I'm interested through my images and through my work in actively pursuing not only how can buildings be resilient, but how we can stop the rate of climate change as it stands now.
So thank you, Matt. You know, just piggybacking on that, on this question, like my second question is like, it seems to me that resiliency is often thought of as an added cost. So, you know, it's always something added later, and you all mentioned the need to think about it ahead of time. So can you elaborate a little bit about on that? Does it have to be an added cost? Does it have to be that way, or how would you go about it?
Well, I think if it were mandated by governmental authorities, it wouldn't necessarily be an added cost. So a parallel example is with LEED, it often being an option, that can drive up the prices of those quote-unquote sustainable materials because only the most costly buildings can afford to be LEED Platinum. So if it's mandated, as California is doing, Marin County, you actually have to be green, all of the producers are going to lower their prices. So I think it doesn't have to be more expensive. Right now, it's a good investment. You're not going to lose your house, but it should just cost the same.
Thank you. Yeah, anybody else that wants to add to this?
Yeah, I can try and answer this as well. I mean, in terms of, again, earthquakes, that's my focus. Let me start with a little background, actually. So the way we're designing buildings today in 2014, per the building code, is basically to allow our new facilities to be significantly damaged under a 500-year earthquake. And that earthquake, in other terms, basically occurs, it has a 10% chance of occurring in a 50-year lifetime of the building. So there is a possibility that this earthquake occurs, and if it does occur, the building itself, and for that matter the city, will sustain significant damage that may be irreparable. So we're talking not even about functionality here, we're just talking about is it even repairable, and how long will it take to repair. So if you look at Christchurch in New Zealand right now, you know, 3 years after some pretty big earthquakes there, they are just starting to rebuild right now. So that's the baseline that we're looking at right now. So how much does it cost to improve above that baseline? We've been doing a lot of research with Stanford. A lot of other people are doing some research, and we're finding that the increase or the cost premium on the first costs, the hard costs of the building, are on the order of 0 to 10% of the baseline costs. So, you know, and really if you adopt innovative strategies, design strategies, you can easily get that closer to the 0% number. So, and these are for new buildings. So it's a lot easier to implement these things on new buildings for very little additional investment, make significant improvements on the resilience so that these buildings can be functional after a 500-year earthquake instead of damaged, significantly damaged.
Okay. So it's a good investment, essentially.
It is a good investment.
Yeah. And Brad, what do you want? Do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think that there's that resiliency in a way it goes beyond. I mean, I know that we're talking about buildings here, but there's, you know, the difference between sustainability, which really is in a lot of ways specific to a building, and resiliency is that resiliency deals with you know, even if the building stands up and it remains functional, there's other systems, water, you know, there's schools, there's all kinds of other you know, resiliency basically can't be contained to the building, and I think that's interesting, and I think that there's a, you know, in addition to buildings or like building heavy infrastructure like levees, which is often talked about after earthquakes. You know, it's been proposed in New York Harbor after Sandy, which is really expensive and takes a lot of time. There's a lot of easier and softer approaches to achieving resiliency. You know, I think there's been studies that have been done that have shown that the communities that have the highest survival rates after heat waves, for example, aren't necessarily the ones that are the wealthiest and have the most resources, or, you know, but it often has to do with how close-knit the community is, and how you know, if communities know each other and know who's vulnerable, they know who to look for, and that things like that have a really big impact as well.
So what you're bringing up is really that it's not just about the building, but it's also about the community and the human element.
Yeah, that's right, and I do think that as architects we think about at least in the work that, for example, David Baker Architects does, where we're designing multifamily housing, we're doing it in the urban context. We're always thinking about how do we foster community, and I think that something like that. How do we foster a connection with the surrounding neighborhood, right? I think things like that are equally important and don't necessarily have to cost a lot of money.
Great. So I want to move on to my next question, unless anybody wants to add anything else to this. Okay, perfect. So let me just do a really quick screen share here. And this question is for Ibbi. So Ibbi, you recently led the development of the REDi Rating System with Arup, which provides owners, architects, and engineers a framework for implementing resilience-based earthquake design. So can you share a bit about this report? Are these concepts that can be applied to other hazards as well? I know it's probably a ton of stuff to talk about, but
yeah. I'll try. Yeah, I'll try and give you the soundbite. Yes, it's absolutely applicable to other hazards. I mean, if you apply the same concepts that we've developed for earthquakes, we should be able to apply those for floods and climate change related weather events, and we actually have plans of developing these guidelines for a suite of different natural hazards. This is the first one. So basically, yeah, the REDi Rating System, as you mentioned, is a framework we've developed to allow owners, architects, and engineers to implement resilience-based earthquake design, which is basically a holistic design, planning, and verification approach to allow us to achieve beyond code resilience objectives. I mentioned before that the baseline objectives of the code, I would say, aren't very good. We're expecting significant damage to the building, to the non-structural components, architectural components, mechanical components, and it could be very costly to repair them if they're repairable. And while we provide life safety, people should be safe in these buildings. Whether they can get back in and use them again within a certain time period, let's say even on the order of months or years, is up for debate. So anyways, the REDi Rating System basically contains specific design criteria and guidelines based on our lessons learned from past earthquakes, by identifying in the traditional code approach and the current best practice approach. It contains recommendations for specific planning measures. The purpose really is to identify all the things which could hinder functionality of a building after or during an earthquake and mitigate them through design and planning. And we verify the success of the design and planning measures by performing a FEMA-based loss assessment, which relates the expected demands in the building, displacements, accelerations in the building, to damage in each of the building components, to the consequences of that damage in terms of repair costs and downtime. That's the short version. If you want to find out more, obviously, we actually do have it downloadable on our website at arup.com/publications, and I'll just flash it up on the screen here. Here's the guideline, and it's pretty extensive, so I can't really go through all of it today. But
that's great. Brad and Matt, is there anything you want to say about this or ask Ibbi about it?
Yeah, I think it's really really great and interesting, and I guess maybe my question would go back to a comment I made earlier about because resiliency is really about more than just the individual building. I'm curious, are there ways that this system or this rating system might be extended, or is that something that you guys have considered to think about, like a city at large, or?
Yeah, I mean, resilience is so complex and in a sense overwhelming. We always talk about oh my God, the world, the sky is falling, what can we do about it? And so really this is trying to carve out one little piece of the puzzle that gives us the power, empowers us, the designers, the design professionals, the owners, really to do something about it in their own right, as private citizens. And really this is just a building block. So we're looking at individual specific buildings. Cities in parallel need to be strengthening their infrastructure, putting up seawalls, all sorts of other things that, there's other people working on that. I'm sure there's experts. This is our little piece of the puzzle that we're trying to bring out there and make accessible. So, 99.9% of the buildings right now are being designed to a code level, and we're trying to make that into other way around. We're trying to flip it. 99.9% of the buildings should be designed to these beyond code objectives. And if you look at a city and you say that all the buildings in it, they are resilient in and of themselves, and if we can make the city infrastructure resilient around that, then you have both of those things. But you do have to look at both. I do agree. There's building specifics, and then there's the city specific resilience, and they both need to be enhanced, improved to get us to these levels. Now, I will say in REDi, we are also looking at external factors. So, siting is important. You can't be sited in high liquefaction or high tsunami zones if you want a platinum rating. You do have to consider utility disruption. You need to have backup systems if you want to be operational within days after an earthquake. These are all the types of things that you need to consider if you want to be resilient.
Great. I have a first question from our audience, actually, right here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. So, Soraya, thank you for watching and sending this question. How would resiliency be offered with containerized living? Do you know?
Well, I missed the. I'm sorry, I missed the.
Yeah, I missed that too.
I will also put it in the chat for you, so you can read it as well. Okay, so how would resiliency be offered with containerized? Maybe I'm saying it wrong. Sorry, it's my accent, my Italian accent. Living. Anybody who wants to take this?
Is that referring to?
I think Soraya is watching this live, so this is the beauty of a Google Hangout. We can ask her for any explanations we need.
Well, I'll answer again through some of my own images, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Soraya, let us know if that's not okay.
So I think container living is quite exciting. You have Lodek, who does some really exceptional design work in that area. I'm interested in sort of hybrid prefab, the idea that you could have a box, and I'm showing you an example of one. I'll try to get it to change here. There we go. But yet, once you go into the box, it's really not like living in a container, because a lot of the spans that containers offer aren't necessarily proportioned towards human systems. And so you could have something that looks like a box, but as long as you articulate it, you add materials that are softer, you may find that you're using renewable materials. It's not all steel, but there might be a steel stair or something. But by using woods and other natural materials, you're creating something that is a little bit more pleasing to the touch. It might not overheat when you touch it, and you can regrow a lot of these trees. So I think you need a balance of steel structure and wood structures, and if we become entirely dependent on containerized living, in a way it can potentially become a limitation. I think it's really exciting, but I'm not sure it's always resilient. Yes, we could reuse or recycle containers, but were they really meant for human use? I'm just sort of posing that question.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Anybody who wants to add anything to this? Okay. All right. So while we wait for more questions from our audience, I'm gonna move to my to one more of my questions. So how do you approach issues of resiliency when designing or working with residential versus non-residential buildings? Do you have the same approaches to residential and non-residential, or is different approaches, or can you talk a little bit about that?
I might be able to touch on this a little bit. I think one of the differences is that with residential buildings, I think it's really important for them to be able to do a lot of the things that Ibbi was talking about in terms of not only not for sort of falling down, but also being able to stay online and sustain the residents and still have access to power and water and all these very important things. I think that going back to something I was saying earlier about resiliency has to do with also not only with the building but with the community and the community's ability to stay sort of alive, essentially. There's things like grocery stores and schools and religious institutions that provide support to communities in the wake of a disaster. And it's really important not only for those buildings to remain standing and to remain functional, but it's also important for those institutions to continue functioning. And so there's beyond the building, I think there's also there needs to be a plan, like a kind of operations plan. And the local cash project that our office did sort of dealt with that a little bit, and I'll show a few images here of it.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're making a really interesting point, which is some non-residential buildings are actually the buildings that we will rely on to help people who are displaced or need help in case of an emergency. And so there's an added need for them to be resilient and to be usable even in the case of a natural catastrophe.
That's right. So I'm actually having a little bit of a hard time pulling.
No problem.
Getting this to share, but
I can screen share for you if you want.
Sure, that would be good. Yeah.
Let me just 1 second right here. Let's see. Okay, so I will try to follow along and switch slides here for you. So let me know.
Okay. Unfortunately, where I can't see your. Oh, okay, I can see it a little bit. Yeah. So, well, in any case, the proposal was it tried to sort of in the way that sustainability has kind of been in a way, through the LEED system. There's a brand associated with it. So there's kind of almost there's a value for businesses and for governments and for developers to be associated with the LEED system and to be able to say that they're sustainable, they have a sustainable building. We proposed a kind of branding system whereby organizations and that can actually act as resources in a time of disaster that are located like within individual communities, the kinds of resources I was talking about earlier, which are maybe churches or health clinics or even supermarkets or pharmacies that can offer water and food and such, might actually develop a plan for how they're going to do that, and they could have a sign out in front of their business that says, we're prepared to give back to the community in a time of disaster, and that has a kind of PR value to it, and it helps people know what's going to be available to them. It encourages communities to sort of prepare themselves, and so it makes visible the resources in a very passive way as you're just walking down the street and sort of see the signage and so that's what that proposal was about.
Great. So let me switch back to you right here. Okay. Anybody else that wants to add, that wants to talk about their work?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the idea of residential versus commercial or other structures. I think in America we've made perhaps too much of a distinction between the two. I have a wonderful daughter. I hope that she's not home when there's an earthquake. In other words, we really haven't built our houses to survive what's going to happen. We had a big one in 1989. There was a lot of property damage. People lost their homes. Yet, almost 30 years later, we're only starting to get the soft story legislation. So I think this is a real big issue. And so what I do in my work, and I'm going to do a screen share, is I apply commercial technology to residential buildings often, and I try to do it at a cost-effective price. So I'll see if we can cycle through these. This is an image of my client's house after Hurricane Sandy. So you can see that reinforced concrete has been ripped up. A lot of the wood was gone. The only things that are still standing are some of these thin, spindly steel structures. So I took that into account, and in our structural design, coordinated an effort where we used very thin, spindly, lightweight and cost-effective tubular steel columns supported atop a concrete structure. So it's very lightweight, but very strong. Almost all moment connections welded. The final project would be like this. You could use the ground floor. So this is a large house. You can do it at a much smaller scale. But the idea is that you're using commercial structure on a residential building. It enables you to cantilever vertically over the water. And as the floods come in, you can use the underground space and still use the space above. So the idea is that, and I think modern architecture is all about this, that there was a new technology that came in the 20th century with steel and concrete, and architects were going to experiment how to use this. And that succeeded and it failed, but I think we need to try harder because we've gone back to relying on these stick structures, which after living in Italy, you come back and you've been living in these wonderful stone vaults that have been there for thousands of years, and you come back and you see these wood structures that the termites are eating apart, and I mean, it looks like the three pigs are going to row away and their little house is going to fall down. So I think, again, applying high-tech technology at a cost-efficient price is really important to solve some of these issues.
Thank you, Matt. That's actually a great example of how you can really sort of go from one category to the other, right, and not just get stuck in this division.
Right. There should be no division, because if you're sleeping in your house at night and there's a huge earthquake, in fact, I think a lot of earthquakes have tended to strike very early in the morning, you're likely going to be in your house. You're not going to be in a big protected office building. So, I think the codes need to be a little bit more stringent. Right now we're looking at soft stories for maybe mixed-use buildings or houses with large garages, but it's still not addressing single-family homes necessarily, and that's something to look at.
Yeah. So I was going to follow up with a couple of the comments. So so I think you just mentioned the 1989 earthquake was the big one. I just want to clarify that actually that one's the small one. Where the big one is going to be much larger than that, and there's going to be much more widespread destruction if we kind of continue with the baseline, I would say. So. It's kind of given that that earthquake, I would say, gave us a false sense of security that actually what we've got in the built environment right now is actually pretty good. There wasn't much loss of life, there wasn't that much damage overall, but the big one's actually going to be a lot worse than that. In terms of, I wanted to, I agree definitely with what Brad was saying, where you do have to consider. Really all buildings, I would say, or all occupancy types almost as being equal. Residential, supermarkets, pharmacies, all of those are important for the resilience of the community because these are all interdependent. In terms of what we do for resilience, looking at non-residential versus residential, I could say I know that in a residential, you really want to get the residents back in the building as soon as possible. That's the first thing, so that they can at least shelter in place. And that means, there might not be power, there might not be water, they might need to provide their own blankets, the bottled water, all those sorts of things, but at least they've got a shelter. And that might last for 30 days, depends what the owner's resilience objectives are. But really more than 30 days until the power and water get turned back on, that might be a problem. So, whereas that's a residential, whereas for an office, you might allow a lot more than that. You don't need people living there. You might want people to get back to work within a few months. So the objectives are a little bit differently. But all in all, we should all be, all the resilience objectives, we should raise the bar, I think, for everything, all different types of occupancies. There really shouldn't be that much differential between them all.
So, I really like how you all have a slightly different perspective and focus for your work. And I want to invite everybody watching again to send the questions, because we have really three experts that share a lot in common and also have very specific expertise. So this is your chance to ask them questions live. Okay, and I have a lot more questions for you, so I'm going to keep going. So, I'm very excited about this hangout today because we have two architects and an engineer here. So I can ask you how you can collaborate with each other to implement resiliency in projects. And of course, Ibbi, you get to talk for all engineers.
Yeah.
But why don't we start with you?
I think the most important thing is to, at the inception of a project, even in concept design, to get together in a room with the design team, the architects, the engineers, and the owner to discuss the resilience objectives of the facility, under what hazards we're considering, whatever threats we're considering, to identify the risk drivers to those resilience objectives, and to mitigate those risks. And so really, I think it's just to have the conversation to communicate better, because we really aren't doing that yet as a standard of best practice. So I think communication is key, and as long as, obviously we have to integrate our designs architecturally and engineering wise to reach those objectives, but just to start having that conversation is the most important thing, I think.
Great. And Matt, do you want to add? How do you like to work with engineers, or what do you think should be done better?
I think it's a great collaboration. I think architects, of course, have sort of put themselves in a corner by not doing a lot of engineering these days. Mm-hmm. And so I think I would hope that in the future of architectural education, we are teaching more building technology as inseparable from the aesthetics, because Ibbi probably loves it, but he'll get some complicated project, and it's many more design hours that he's going to have to solve that issue for the client. So if the architect either looks at some of those issues from the start and or works up front with the engineer, they're going to save the client a lot of money. So I think that 100 years ago, architects were also engineers. I don't really see much of a distinction. Perhaps because of liability, we've made a big distinction. But I review all of my engineers' drawings. They're going to come up with solutions I hadn't thought of. So I'm not pretending that an architect can do it all. I mean, working with an engineer is just, we can't survive without them. He knows that.
Yeah.
I'm interested because you studied in Italy as well. Is it the same thing in Italy, where it's so separate?
Well, Italy is one of the roots of the evil, of course, but because of postmodernism, which started over there, and that architecture became an image, and architects treated the facade, and the Beaux-Arts, it's not just the Italians, but and so early on, we were all master builders, architects, engineers. We actually thought about construction. I like to think of Spain and the Spanish education. When I worked in Italy, we actually were sort of more closely tied to architects like Enrique Miralles. We actually collaborated with him. And so when we perceived the idea, it was really a constructed idea. So we thought about the engineering from the beginning. And so I think that's probably my experience in Europe, which was really helpful. And there were smaller companies, materials companies. So for example, even in materials engineering, we could invent ideas, we could patent them, we could put them into production and use them on our buildings, as opposed to selecting them from a catalog. I think that's one of the main distinctions.
Okay, thank you. And Brad, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I agree completely with the points that Matt and Ibbi made. I think architects and engineers obviously are very good at collaborating with one another, and I think that making buildings more resilient is really, in many ways, just about starting the dialogue. And I think starting the dialogue at the beginning of projects and as early as possible. And I think that it's just important to note that both the architects, the issues that architects deal with in terms of how the building is organized and how it relates to its surrounding context, both the ecological context and the urban fabric. those things are really important, and I think those are things that the architect can bring to the project, and then of course the structural engineer brings a tremendous amount too, just in terms of creating buildings. In the case of a residential building, that allows people to shelter in place and is able to withstand whatever the disaster may be.
Yeah, and so I have some few questions from the audience right here. In particular, hi Amy, I have Amy from Public Architecture, and she is watching our Hangout Live, and she asked, what are some DIY strategies that people can employ to make their home, work, or school environment more resilient? So is there anything that you can recommend to people, some DIY things?
I think actually I can get this screen sharing thing to work this time, and so I think our local cache project kind of speaks to this question. In many ways it was a kind of DIY or sort of micro intervention that can be made in the urban context of cities. Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yeah, we see all your folders.
Okay, good. So in many ways, the project was trying to think about, in some sense, like when people think about resilient design, they might think about things like this, big and heavy and expensive, and we were really trying to think about smaller, sort of softer approaches. And so, there's actually a really interesting system in San Francisco of below-grade cisterns that are located all across the city that contain water, so that firefighters can fight fires even if the plumbing doesn't work, if the water mains are broken. And it's this distributed system that's located in almost not almost all, but many of the neighborhoods in San Francisco. And we sort of were really interested in this, these sort of unknown resources that exist in communities. Like, a lot of people walk by these things every day and don't know what they are, and they actually have real value to the community in a time of disaster. But
Brad, did you mean to click on one of these images that you have on one of your folders?
Sure. So, this is an image of a street intersection with a cistern in it. This is actually an image of what one of those cisterns looks like. It's demarcated by a brick ring in the street.
I don't see that image. It might be opening another window.
Oh no. Oh, I see what's going on.
You know what I mean? So you might want to leave the screen share and then come back in stuck in that image.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Let's see here.
Everybody watching this looks way easier than it is when you're doing it live. So we'll give Brad there a second to get his image ready. But yeah, I realized that even living in San Francisco, I don't know about a lot of these things that are in place. So this Hangout is pretty great for me as well, because I'm learning a lot.
So is that working now?
Now you're back, but you.
Okay, good.
You were on the right path, because I kind of saw. If you want to try your screen share right now, it should appear.
Okay. Gosh, I apologize, guys. I'm sort of losing.
No, it's okay.
So this is what one of those cisterns looks like, and I'm going to quickly kind of flip through some images here. But the idea here was that
you're not in screen share, so you want to. Okay. We see you on the screen.
Okay, well, let me try one more time.
No problem, no problem. Okay, so in the meantime, Brad, if you need a couple of minutes, or maybe I have those. Do I have those slides? Do I have those images from you?
You do have some of them, yeah, most of them.
All right, let me just do a screenshot on my side then. Let me see. Okay, so here we go. You should see now some images.
So if you were to go back to that last one, I think.
This
okay. Yeah. So that's sort of. We were really interested in these sort of hidden resources that exist in communities that might be like a medical clinic that's prepared to stay open, or there's actually there might be a church that's prepared to provide shelter, and so similar to these cisterns, we're interested in kind of marking what these resources are in a very visible way, so that people could become familiar with them, and it also, as I was saying earlier, marking them with a kind of brand that has meaning to people. So we designed a mark that says this is a resource in a time of disaster. By doing that, it sort of incentivizes other businesses or other businesses or institutions that have something to offer to to make those resources available to people, because and to hang this sign up in front of their business, essentially, because that has a kind of a PR benefit to them. So similar to the LEED system, which provides some value for when a building is designed to be associated with it, has some value to organizations. This system might do something similar in terms of resiliency.
So if I scroll forward here, is this one of the cisterns you were talking about?
It is, yeah, that's right. So we're trying to kind of harness the image of the symbolic sort of nature of the cistern as this hidden resource, and kind of mark it and start to raise awareness of that as one example of a hidden resource, and then expand on that by using this circular green dot to mark other resources and communities.
Okay, I see. Yeah, this would be great, because as I was saying, like I wouldn't know about this, and I live here, so that's the kind of stuff I would want to know before a disaster, right? Okay, let me see. I have other questions actually. So I have another question. How would resiliency be offered in third world countries in terms of keeping their costs down? Perhaps low-cost materials, diverse methods? Anybody here that has that kind of experience, by the way?
Well, when we teach, we often look at third world countries and how we can help them. It's a great way to work with an organization and have the students travel and help build communities with their hands and even design them. So at the University of San Francisco, which has a new architecture department, that's one of our focuses. And while a local community might be building with mud brick, you don't necessarily want to use the mud brick by itself. You might reinforce it with a very simple fabric. So this fabric, obviously it's not a big complicated piece of concrete, it's very lightweight, but if you reinforce the windows and other areas which are at risk from seismic activity, it can be a low-cost way that you're using a sort of high-tech, very thin application for a community that is in need, that can't afford something very complicated. So in other words, you can combine a local traditional building technology to keep people employed and to keep people building the way they've always built, but you can introduce some very subtle but strong strategies to reinforce what they have.
Thank you, Matt. And Ibbi and Brad, anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, I don't have much. Arup has a lot of experience in the third world and resilient strategies in the third world. We actually our director of international development, Joe De Silva, was actually recently selected to give a very prestigious lecture series about what she calls shifting agendas from response to resilience, and really the whole lecture and the accompanying publication is really about what strategies to implement, low-cost strategies to implement in third world countries to improve resilience. So that would probably be the best resource in terms of that. I would also say the problem in the third world is very different than the problem we have here. Again, going back to earthquakes, where now in the modern, the developed world, we're looking at life safety as the baseline objective and trying to go beyond that. We have the luxury, really, I would say, of going beyond that. Whereas in the third world, we're just trying to get to life safety. You know, look at Haiti. I mean, how many 100,000 people died in Haiti because of unreinforced concrete? So we're just looking to reinforce the concrete there. So, you know, cost you know, it's not. It's I don't know if it's really about costs at that point. You know, we just need to put reinforcement in there to protect lives. So we just need to get to that baseline in those countries. Then we have the luxury of going beyond that and looking at costs and low-cost strategies to improve beyond that.
Yeah. So, thank you. And I want to note we only have 10 minutes left. So, let me see. What I want to say is that since most of the people who watch our Hangout series are architects, I was wondering if you have 3 top tips to incorporate resiliency in their designs. No tips. All right, that's it.
I'll give the architects some tips. Yeah. Well, the one I already talked about was, I think the most important thing is to get in a room with the design team and discuss the resilience objectives, the risk drivers, the risk mitigation measures with the owner, and really everyone get on the same page and all strive for that. And as an architect, put resilience at the top of your design criteria and make that important for the design, and also make that important for the owner. You know, so the owner knows that resilience. You know, actually, I mean, the owner needs to be educated to some level. They don't know necessarily what type of building they're going to get. You know, at least again from an earthquake perspective, they just assume that what they get from us is, you know, functional after an earthquake. We have to educate them usually. So just to educate the owner, get everyone on the design team together on board. That's number one. Number two, I would say implement the sustainable design strategies you're already doing, like natural daylighting, natural ventilation, temperature conditioning, because it reduces the dependence of the facility on the utility grid, which will definitely be out after an earthquake for you know, days to weeks. And so really anything we can do to reduce the dependence on utilities would be great. So that's number two. Number three is really, I would say, it's really in the details of the architectural components, detailing of things like facades and partitions to accommodate earthquake displacements or drifts without damage. That's important. So they should not be damaged. Right now we're allowing them to be damaged. And we should be, and architects should be prepared to modify their specs to incorporate those types of things for those components and other components like elevators and mechanical components and other non-structural components. So those are my top three for architects.
So I have one, and I'm going to put on my architect historian cap, which I never wear. But on my Fulbright, I studied historical architectures related to modern architecture, and I think we're always trying to invent something new. We always assume we live in the first world. So can you see my slides?
Yes, yes. Okay. Thank you.
You know, this is a sketch I did after, I think it was a painting by Canaletto, but, you know, Venice 500, 1,000 years ago had pretty sophisticated technology. They had bridges, they had buildings which were built on the waterfront, and it flooded a little bit, and they had columns to accommodate that. We're just starting to use that here in a lot of communities. And there were beautiful buildings that came out of pretty simple, straightforward technologies. And so as we move forward, we look at the San Francisco waterfront. We really have to rely on history. We look at some of the port buildings that were built, and if you can see on the right-hand side here, there's this beautiful trust. It must be Pier 27 or something. It's like a bridge, and it floats over the water. It's so much more advanced than a lot of what we have now. And foundations. You know, the Venetians learned how to build great foundations. We still use wood, actually. On our New Jersey house, we have 40-foot piles driven underneath with concrete on top, very similar to this. You might lose your teddy bear, but at least the building is still standing, as you can see this picture. But look at that. This is by Favaro and Milan for our University of Venice headquarters. This is a micropile foundation, and it's very similar to the original historical foundation, but it's done with modern materials, so it's reinforced concrete instead of brick. So the idea is you can make a beautiful community. It can be modern or based on history, but I think we can't forget the lessons of history, and we can't assume that we're living in the first world, because the way our houses are built is a real shame. I mean, you know, when I grew up here, native San Francisco, and I love this city, but why can't we put the telephone poles underground? I mean, you go to most other places in the quote-unquote first world, and they're all underground. So I think there are a lot of issues that we have to grapple with in America. We have a myth that we live on this city on the hill, and we have to educate other people how to build better, but I think we have a lot to deal with right here at home.
All right. So, Brad, that's your turn for our 3 tips.
Yeah, I don't know that I have 3 tips, but I think that resiliency is really about being proactive, and I think it really is a change in the status quo. And I think that we're starting to think about not only the ways that buildings can be less harmful to the environment, but that they can actually have a positive impact on the environment and the abilities of people and communities to withstand natural disasters. And I think that that's kind of a change in mindset in a lot of ways. There was a proposal that I found really inspiring, done several years ago for New York Harbor by a landscape architecture firm called Scape, that proposed putting. They basically designed a network of scaffolding for oyster beds to be put back into New York Harbor. There's not really the shellfish in New York Harbor, due to pollution and other reasons, went away, and they designed this scaffolding to kind of allow these creatures to come back. And they actually, the benefits of it are not only in terms of addressing an issue of global warming, which is rising rising water levels and storm surges. It would actually reduce the impact of storm surges if this proposal was implemented, but it also had a kind of social and economic benefit. It kind of created an economy around these shellfish, and in terms of there's an industry associated with them, and bringing them back and provide jobs to people, and there was a kind of social benefit. They had programming associated with these oyster beds, and it kind of created a water aquatic park in a way. And so there was a kind of social, ecological, economic benefit to this, and there really wasn't a whole lot of cost, and it had it could really have a positive impact. And I think that just the very idea that we can, as designers, propose something like that actually, it's not just about not doing bad to the environment, but it's about actually changing things changing things in a positive way is a really profound idea, and something that I think that architects are starting to think a lot more about. So.
Okay, so if everybody here can hang out for a couple more minutes, I do want to ask the last question from our audience. I have a landscape architecture student here. His name is, I'm gonna so mispronounce this, but Lucas, I think. Hi, Lucas. So nowadays, the Rebuilt by Design project in New York City is a quite hot topic. San Francisco and other Delta cities are dealing with the same problem, flooding. What do you think, this is what Lucas is asking, what do you think about looking at the site from a broader perspective and dealing with resilience from that level?
Well, I think this is great, Lucas, and I have a couple slides to show from Japan that we know from many of the great historical disasters, the London fire, the Chicago fire. These became elements which changed the course of architectural history. So I worked with my students at University of San Francisco in Ishinomaki and the reconstruction of the city, and the river which flooded became a real opportunity for landscape. As you can see here, this is one of my students' proposals. We would create barriers that would be walls to the flooding, but they would be landscape barriers. It's a real opportunity for landscape architecture throughout the city. This was a city which had really gone downhill in the last 40 or 50 years, run over by the automobile, very little pedestrian life. So by using a really awful natural disaster, the Japanese were looking at building a 30-foot high wall. So we researched medieval cities. We thought, wow, this is wonderful because medieval cities are some of the most pedestrian environments. So you see here, this is a network of green paths by a student. You can see this wall here in the center that would be a landscape park. And then it becomes an opportunity for architectural infills. So again, it's a sort of new kind of architecture that arises out of the flood. It's just an incredible opportunity. I mean, there's just awful tragedies that are associated with the disasters we're talking about. We're talking about it as architects and engineers in this sort of abstract way. But if we can build for these kind of disasters the way the Venetians have, the way people have in Thailand, throughout the world, and we look at history, we could build a safer and more beautiful world.
Wow, that sounds kind of like the perfect ending to the hangout. But I do want to give you a chance to say anything before I wrap this up. So is there anything that you want to add to our conversation? And I know we could go on for another 10 hours on the topic, but you know, anything that you want to leave the audience with? No, okay. Last chance. All right, so I think Matt really said it beautifully, that this is not just an issue of design, but it really saves lives, and it's something that architects, designers, engineers are coming together to really make a huge impact in our world. I would like to switch back to my screen share after I thank everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Brad and Ibbi and Matt, for joining us today. I am going to, let me see here if I can get myself ready to say goodbye to everybody watching. So this was our 11th NoVeg Hangout for on how to succeed in architecture. We talked about resilient architecture. Thank you so much for attending if you're watching this live. And remember that all our Hangouts on our YouTube, and you can watch the recording at any time. And you can connect with us on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter. Also, make sure to check out Arup's website and Peak and Kona Studio and David Baker Architects. Great companies and great projects. Thank you, everybody, and see you all next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.